All right, we'll get started. Thank everybody for coming today. My name is Reed Potter. I'm just a local fan of the feud and the feud story, and try to give tours here in town. I've been giving those probably for about 6 years now to any group that comes in town. If I have an opportunity in town, I'll do those. Really enjoy doing them, and I like telling the story. And I always start every tour out the same way I'll start this morning. So how many people in the room are related to the McCoys, or anyone that sided with the McCoys in the feud? So we have 1, 2, 3. All right, anybody in the room that's related to the Hatfields or any of those who fought with or sided with the Hatfields? We have 2. All right, so that means I have to be really careful today. So I like the tours where nobody's kin to anybody and I don't have to worry as much about who's going to get offended, but I always try to be careful with this story. And if you notice, there's a huge stack of books on the feud, and hardly any of those agree. And you have to ask yourself, if you're new to this story, is how can that be?
How can it be? Because nobody ever went to the courthouse and read an official record.
So, as Betty says, a lot of stories were handed down. So I want you to think of it this way. The equivalent probably today to our generation would be the O.J. Simpson story. Now, everybody watched that trial in almost the whole country, right? And you got different perspectives on it. And when the trial was over, O.J. was found innocent or not guilty. So you don't have to hold up your hands, but I'm assuming a lot of you probably believe that he did kill his wife. Most of the people in the country did, but many did not. And a lot of that just depends on which side you're looking at that story from. So in the same way this story came down, if you're from West Virginia, you probably saw the story from the viewpoint of the Hatfields. If you're from Kentucky, you probably saw the story and recognized it from the viewpoint of the McCoys and those who were with them. And let me say right off the bat that even though it's called the Hatfield-McCoy feud, there were many other people involved. There are also many people in both families who did not get involved. So just because you have McCoy ancestry doesn't mean that your ancestor in any way got involved in this fight. Same thing with the Hatfields, especially the Kentucky Hatfields. Most of the Kentucky Hatfields had nothing to do with this feud, or very little to do with the feud, and they didn't support Devil Anse, which was William Anderson Hatfield.
Read something I found that really shocked me. And I wrote it up and sent it to the Kentucky Explorer, and they did publish it. I started looking at these people where they lived, and I discovered that every Hatfield that lived in Kentucky was Union and supported Randolph. Everyone that lived in West Virginia supported Devil Anse. The breakup was on where you lived.
Right.
Deacon Anse, he was in the Union Army. He was in 39.
A lot of those boys were.
Yeah.
So
they supported Randolph.
And that brings us to our first point of convention. By the way, this is Betty, Phillips, Howard. So if you think of Frank, you think of Betty's family, Frank Phillips. But she is an incredible resource that has taught me so much over the years and sent me so many emails. When I was going through all my information last night, I have stacks of emails that I printed off that she sent when she finds research. So the first thing she brings up is the Civil War, and that's also contentious. Did the feud start from the Civil War? Now, there's several points to that. I firmly believe it did in this regard. And it all starts with this document. I'll pass around today. I'm sorry it's not a better copy. I meant to get here early and get it copied, but we got started talking. I didn't get that done. But I'll pass it around so everybody can see it. The important part about this, it's over at the courthouse here. The original document it's the closing of the county court December 31st, 1861. It's signed by William Cecil. And if you notice right here, the signature is smeared. Now remember, back then they didn't use ink pens like we did. They were actually dipping them in ink. So you had to let that dry first, and it seems as if they closed the book too quick. That's the only time I've seen this in this book, that it's smeared. So you got to ask yourself what's going on there. This is December 31st, 1861. The war has begun. Pikeville starts out being Confederate. All the politicians here are Confederate except for one. The Confederate forces move in. The Army's camped here in town until that fall when the first Union troops come up. General Nelson comes into town, takes over the town, runs the Confederates out of town. He then retreats because he has no resources here to feed his troops. The Confederates come back. William Cecil is a Confederate sympathizer. He is the richest man in town, the richest man in the county, and also the county judge. December 31st, he closes out the court. He signs that document that he's adjourning court, and it seems to be in a hurry. Well, we know what's going on. We have another Union Army coming up to Big Sandy, led by Garfield, who later becomes, as James A. Garfield, later becomes President of the United States, and that all starts here. His rise to presidency starts here. As he comes up the valley, he retakes Pikeville again. William Cecil, shortly after signing this document, as the Union troops come into town, is shot and killed.
By who?
Well, no one was ever arrested that I know of, but there's many rumors of who that could be. Can we wait to after, and we'll get that, just for the TV's sake. So, yeah, Betty will go deep into any of that stuff that you want. The other thing interesting about that document that I love, and it helps tell the story best, if you notice the next sentence down, there's hardly any space between those. Court reconvenes. It says May 1865. So there's no gap in that book. There's no blank pages. They just start right back up from December 31st to May 1865. There is no court. There is no police. There's no 911 to call. It's total chaos. If you're in the mountains of central Appalachia, on the border area, that's the way it was. And that's a bad place to be. Now, I don't know where you're from today. I'm assuming there's people here from outside the area. If you're from Atlanta or New York or Columbus, Ohio, and there's no law for 4 years, there's no one to call when something goes bad. Every town has bad people in it, and those bad people are going to turn loose, right? The people who have always been bad and always created crimes, now they're turned loose and no one can stop them. So it's a very horrible situation. What starts happening here and elsewhere in this area is the men who have gone away to join the armies, and by the way, Pike County as well as the rest of Kentucky is fighting 2 to 1 for the North. But when this trouble starts back home, a lot of those men come out of the Army when their terms are up. Some of them desert and come home because they're afraid and they fear for the lives of their families. They are not only being harassed, killed, having things stolen from them. I mean, anything that can go wrong, from rape to murders going on back here, and no police force to guard that. No one can be put in jail. There's no trials taking place. But in addition to that, as each army comes through town, at least, no matter which army it is, when an army comes through town, at least they have some law and order, as long as that army's here. The problem is the armies don't stay here long. They can't. There's no food up here. This is the end of the river. This river only flows big enough to get food up here about 6 months out of the year. If it's frozen over, you can't get food and stocks up here for the armies. If it's in the summertime and it's a dry time, you can't get boats up here. So the people have their own food stocks, but when the armies come in, they eat all that food. So people are literally starving to death during this time. It's a horrible time for this area. So the men come back out of the armies. They've been off fighting the war somewhere. They come back and they start trying to protect their families. They start forming units together called Home Guard. And as the name implies, they're guarding their homes. The only problem is they're not all guarding their homes on the same side of the war. The war's still going on, so some of those men become Southern-leaning Home Guard. Those are usually troops that came out of the CSA or the state guards, and they've come back and are forming Home Guards, but they're fighting against their neighbors who are Northern Home Guard. Now, that's a unique situation in this country. That doesn't happen elsewhere. We're on the border. We have no law and order. If you live in Lexington or Frankfort or Louisville or anywhere else in the United States, just about, the war's going on, at least you have law and order. You still have a court system that's functioning. Here we do not. So these Home Guards all form and start fighting each other. and really bad things going on there. Home guards have no rules. It's unlike the regular armies where if an officer does something wrong, they can be court-martialed. They can be shot and killed. They can be thrown out of the military. Back here, the home guards have no rules. So that brings us into the story. If you look at this piece in the museum, and you'll have time after we finish today, this bed is believed to have belonged to Asa Harmon McCoy. Asa Harmon had fought in the Union Army. He was a brave soldier who had re-enlisted after his initial term was over with. He, like many people in this area, didn't always agree with the rest of his family. In fact, his brother Randolph McCoy was fighting for the Southern cause in the Home Guard, and then probably, although we can't prove this, but probably in the regular forces too. Randolph is captured in 1863 and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Ohio, where he spends the rest of the war, doesn't get out until the summer of 1865. So if you know anything about the Civil War, you'll know that those prisoner of war camps were horrible. Most of the people sent there died. You didn't live through that. Disease was rampant. The northern prisons were a little bit better than the southern, but not much. It wasn't a good place to be. Asa Harmon, in the meantime, his brother's fighting for the Northern Army. Asa Harmon re-enlists towards the end of the year, end of the war in 1864 in December, but he's sent home on furlough so he can spend Christmas with his family. So he comes back to Pike County, meets his family, and when he gets there, and by the way, he's told not to come home because there's trouble with the Hatfields. We don't know what that is yet, except we know the Hatfields are now running as a Southern Home Guard, led by Anse, this local home guard called the Hatfields. Other people are involved in that besides just the Hatfield family. Many other men are involved, but anyway, they meet up with Asa Harmon. The details are a little sketchy about exactly how it happens, but Asa Harmon leaves home to avoid the home guard, and somehow or another is killed. Now, there are many different stories about that killing and who killed him. Squirrel hunting Sam, Big Sam he's called, McCoy, who's also a close relative. He's one of the few participants who writes his own memoir. So it's not somebody telling secondhand the story, he tells his own story. Now, we don't know that he would know this part of the story, but he says that Jim Vance and Devance Hatfield are the two men who found Asa Harmon and shot and killed him. Other people dispute that. So we don't know that. There's no one indicted. There's no court records. And that's one of the important things when you get into these few documents, of, like Betty said earlier, trying to decide what's truth and what's not, is because if it's a court record, at least we have some proof. Although we can disagree with court records, right? Just like with the OJ trial. Many people disagree with that verdict, but yet we know that the verdict, and according to historians, whatever the verdict is in a trial in the last court of appeals, that's the truth. Whether it is or not, that becomes the truth. That's the document of record. When this murder, we have none of that, so we have to go by other people's words. Anyway, Randolph gets out of, the war ends, Randolph gets out of prison, comes back home and finds his brother's been killed. Now, I don't care who you are. Many people say, well, that had nothing to do with the feud. That was years later that real trouble started with the feud. If someone has killed my brother, especially if it's not an official military action, it's a home guard who tracks down my brother and kills him, I'm gonna have a hard time with that. I think most people probably would. I don't know that I'd pick up my gun and go kill them, but I'm not gonna be happy about that. So even though Anse and Randolph fought together early in the war, I think this started causing some tensions. That's my estimation of it anyway. So anyway, that's 1864, 1865. The war ends. Southern soldiers go back home, northern soldiers go back home in eastern Kentucky and all of central Appalachia. Soldiers come back home, but now if you're from the north, if you're from Ohio and you go back home after the war's over with, you're kind of happy, right? It's over with, you got it over with. You're back among your neighbors, everybody wants to move on. Southern soldiers did the same thing. They lost the war. They lost a lot of people. Many of them go home wounded from both sides, but at least you're among people who believe like you did. Everything heals quickly. Here, everybody comes home and you're living next door to the people you just fought against. Not only in the war and the regular soldiers, but the home guard, even more important. So these home guard who have done all these crimes are now living next door to somebody from the other home guard who has maybe done crimes or maybe didn't do crimes. But it tears our social fabric. And it takes a long time to get over that. I believe they didn't get over it until they all died. I think it was in the 1930s before we could reunite. One of the things I show on my tour, if you go up to the United Methodist Church on the head of Main Street, you can see the cornerstone. It says M.E. Church South, 1845. That's an important thing to see. During the war, the Methodist Church here in Pikeville, before the war, 1845, had split. And we had the M.E. Church South on the south side of Main Street, and we had the M.E. Church. It didn't say north, but it was considered north, or the black church, or Negro church. Even though it didn't have black members, it was people who sided with, so it's pro-slavery and anti-slavery. That already split the church years before the war. It wasn't until the 1930s that that church nationwide mended and became the United Methodist Church. So if you ever see that, any sign in the future that says United Methodist Church, you'll know that's why. The northern church, the southern church gets back together and becomes the United Methodist Church. So throughout this community, people try to move on. The courthouse is filled with lawsuits from the war where people had stolen horses, cattle, created crimes. So that's litigated for many years, many years after the war. But basically, just like with that church, that generation has to die before those congregations can get back together again. No more people who had been hurt so deeply that they couldn't even stand to go to church together anymore. So to me, that starts the feud. It doesn't start the feud, and it does and it doesn't start the feud. The feud doesn't begin then, but it starts the animosity between Devil Anse and his group that rode as a Southern Home Guard, and not all Hatfields were in that now, and Randolph McCoy, the one little branch of the McCoy family. Other things happen, and a lot of these are undocumented. They're stories told by different people, and you get different sides of those stories. The next thing, and there were several, but the next big event that's talked about often is the pig fight, or the fight over the pig. Randolph loses a pig. I think most people agree with that. Floyd Hatfield, who's a close relative to Devil Anse, ends up with the pig. There's a trial that takes place at a justice of the peace. Now that's not a criminal trial, that's a civil case where Randolph's trying to win these hogs back. There's actually different stories of who wins that. Most believe that Floyd Hatfield wins the trial and that Devil is even more hurt and has more anger towards the Hatfields. But there's some people that say that he won the trial and it made the Hatfields mad. Either way, there's a trial. Now the reason we don't know much about that is the justice of the peace records do not exist. If you're a justice of the peace, you handle the small matters. You don't record those findings in the courthouse. So you just have to hear from both sides, Kentucky, West Virginia, McCoy, Hatfield, about how the trial took place. We could go into probably a whole day's seminar on the different stories there, but I won't waste our time today. Just know that there was this problem with a hog. And people say, well, why would you have a feud over a hog? And they didn't have a feud over a hog, but then again they did. It's something else that caused this animosity. And the hog was important back then. You didn't go to Walmart or Velocity or Food City and buy your pork to feed your family all year long. You had to raise your hogs. And someone had stolen Randolph's hogs. So his family was going to have to go without meat that year until they could fatten up another hog. So that was a big deal. It wasn't nearly as simple as a $10 hog. $10, by the way, is a lot of money back then, but still, it was a big deal. Now the next big event that people talk about is also undocumented, and that is the romance between Rosanna, and we have, by the way, in the museum on the back side of this cabinet, the original photograph of Rosanna that you've seen published, especially lately since it was brought to the museum and people take photographs and they decide to write a book and they publish it and don't get permission, but we have what I call the happy Rosanna. She had her picture made here in town, and there's a happy and a sad Rosanna photograph. This is the one that we have here. This is happy Rosanna. So Rosanna is a beautiful young lady. She's the daughter of Randolph McCoy. She's 21 years old. She's educated here in town. She goes back home. There's already been trouble between Randolph's set of the McCoys and Jauncey. Jauncey is Devil Anse's son. This is Jauncey. Johnson's considered quite the ladies' man. Don't ask me why, but that's apparently what women were attracted to in the 1880 time frame.
He wasn't very handsome.
Well, I don't think so, but I'm not a woman, so I'll save judgment there. I'm not going to judge him. Anyway, they meet up and they have a romance. A lot of details vary on that story, but they do have a romance. Most agree that Rosanna ends up pregnant. Everyone agrees Randolph is furious. He's told her to stay away from Johnsy, and of course, like a lot of teenagers and 20-year-old girls, when daddy tells you to stay away from some boy, that makes you want him worse, right? So she makes a huge mistake. She's with Johnsy for a while, weeks, months. There's differences in that story, but she comes back home pregnant. Randolph runs her off. He's so embarrassed by this and that she's gone against his wishes and gone to Devil Anse's house and spent the night there, weeks there, and then comes back pregnant, that he's furious over this. He no longer considers her a real McCoy. There's many terms that come out of this feud. That may be one of them. If you look up on the internet, there's all kinds of different variations of where that term comes from. I believe it probably stems from the Hatfield McCoy feud. So he tells her that he's not taking her back in. She's got to go somewhere else. She goes to her Aunt Betty McCoy's house and has the baby. The baby doesn't live long. It dies and is buried there beside Aunt Betty's house, Aunt Betty McCoy. A lot of details are missing at this point in time. There's no death certificates, there's no birth certificates in our courthouse. We can't prove the baby's born, we can't prove the baby's name, we can't prove the day the baby died. The stories say that it was named after both her Aunt Betty and her mother, Sarah Elizabeth. We believe to be the baby's name. There is a marker there. You can go visit that grave today. I believe that is the love child.
Well, at the time I went there, my husband and brother pulled me up there, and we all three slid down on our rear ends.
There's steps to it now. It's very steep, very, very steep, and hard to get to.
We used to take tours through there. We'd tell people about it, and we'd sit and wait if they decided to go up there. Well, I never will forget one guy came down. His whole, from his waist to his knees was wet, or he slid on his butt. He was wet all the rest of the day.
Well, there's some steps there now if you want to go. Now here's a weird twist to the story. Johnsy continues to see Rosanna, even though Rosanna is no longer welcome in the Hatfield house, and he comes across the river and starts seeing her over at Aunt Betty's. So the story goes. It's another thing that we have no court documents to prove this, but many stories from the different families agree on this one. He has indictments against him in Pikeville. One of Rosanna's brothers, Tolbert McCoy, is a deputy sheriff, and he gets the warrant for Johnsy, and he decides that he's going to make Johnsy pay for what he's done to their sister and shamed her. So they hide and they catch Johnsy coming to see Rosanna. They start back to Pikeville with him and 2 or 3 of his brothers, bringing him to jail. Rosanna jumps on a horse, rides over into West Virginia, and tells Devil Anse, "My brothers are going to kill Johnsy. You have to go save him, but you got to promise not to hurt him." Now that doesn't make sense, except when one of the stories tells the detail of her brothers are furious with her too, that she's been with Johnsy. So not only they arrest Johnsy, but she's begging for Johnsy's life, which makes them even madder. And being brothers and sisters, like brothers and sisters can do at that age, one of them tells her, "Say goodbye to your lover because you'll never see him again." She believes they're going to kill Johnsy, not send him to jail for a minor charge. So she rides into West Virginia, she gets Devil Anse rounds up his gang, they come back quickly into Kentucky, they overtake those lawmen who are all her brothers. They have a confrontation there, details vary, depends on who you're listening to, but they don't hurt them. They embarrass them, they humiliate them, but they don't physically harm them. Devil Anse keeps his word, sets them free, takes Johnsy back. Now we know Johnsy comes to Pikeville. We do have a court record of this. We don't know if he comes on his own, if he's arrested later on, or if Devil Anse makes him come to town, but he does come to town. He is arrested and he's convicted on that warrant. So I guess you can make up your own story there, or you can believe the one you want to believe. Some believe that Devil Anse made him come, that he took him away from those lawmen, but he knew that was trouble. So he saved his life, but then he tells him, you've got to go on to jail and take care of this. And so he comes in and takes care of it. Some believe, if you want to believe the best part of Devil Anse, that Devil Anse ran Rosanna off because he knew that Johnsy was two-timing her, not treating her right, and wanted her, was protecting her by telling her to leave. If you don't like Devil Anse, you want to see the other side of that story, you can say he ran her off because he waited for her to get pregnant and then sent her back to her dad in spite. You'll have to decide that when we have no records on that one, just different stories handed down over the years. We do know this though. Johnsy liked the McCoy ladies. So a few months later, he marries Nancy. Nancy is the daughter of Asa Harmon McCoy, the guy that's killed, whose bed we have here in the museum, killed during the war. She's now grown up. She's 15 years old, which is marrying age sometimes in the mountains. She's considered to be beautiful. A lot of the McCoy girls are. Johnsy is told by Devil Anse, some stories say, to never see Rosanna again, to keep away from her. It's going to cause more trouble. So he marries her first cousin. Now they do, this young lady moves over to West Virginia, has 2 legitimate children by Johnsy before she ends up leaving and coming back to her family. An important note here, there's a lot of her family, Asa Harmon McCoy's family, interaction with the Hatfields at this time in a positive way. They do transactions, they marry among the families, and so it seems like that particular family doesn't have the resentment and hard feelings against the Hatfields as maybe Randolph does. So all the McCoys, and it's a huge family, all the McCoys are not in this disagreement at this point, including her family. So anyway, that brings us to the next point. Now we have Tolbert and his brothers who have now been humiliated by the Hatfields. The Hatfield Gang, as they're called in some of the court records. I distinguish specifically when I talk about the Hatfields from this point forward, the gang, as they're called in the court records, is not just Hatfields. In fact, there's some McCoys that are arrested, whether they're innocent or not, because they're not found guilty, but there are some McCoys included with that Hatfield gang. There's other people that are part of that Hatfield gang. There's also many Hatfields in Pike County who are not part of that gang, including our sheriff at the time of the feud, Basil Hatfield, both justices of the peace from that side of the county, and all the constables from over there. All are Hatfields and are not part of that gang. Now there's an election held. This we have a lot of documentation on, well, some. It's 1882. So we've already had the romance, we've had Johnsy settling for another McCoy girl, there's an election, there's a fight breaks out. Different stories there about what happened in the fight. One that makes sense to me is that Tolbert, who's a much smaller man, he is a deputy sheriff still, probably liquored up. I think most people agree with that, as most of the men were at these elections at the end of the day, because that's part of what you did, is a big social function. Meets up with Ellison Hatfield. Ellison is the brother of Devil Anse. Thought I had his picture here, but I don't see it right now. Ellison is a Confederate soldier, a veteran. He's a strong man. He's skilled in fighting and killing. For whatever reason, and there's several reasons given why they fight, they get into a fight. Ellison has his fist and his strength and his size on his side, probably both intoxicated or at least somewhat under the influence. Tolbert has a small knife. It's called a pen knife with a 2-inch blade. Knowing that he's outmatched as they start fighting and the fight gets ugly really quickly, Tolbert pulls a knife and starts stabbing, which infuriates Ellison. Ellison has him on the ground by the throat, beating the daylights out of him, beating him to death. Another brother is said to step in with another small pocket knife and tries to stab him to get him to stop. He throws him off of him. A third brother shows up just as Ellison grabs about a 10-pound rock and comes back over his head to finish off Tolbert. The third brother shows up, pulls a pistol, and shoots Ellison. Ellison arches backwards as the shot goes through his back and says, "I've been shot. I'm dead for certain." He gets up off of Tolbert. He goes over to a tree where he's administered to. The three McCoys get up and take off. The constables there are Hatfields. The justice of the peace, two of them, are both Hatfields. They grab the McCoy boys. They arrest them for this, at this time, shooting and stabbing. Randolph argues that they shouldn't even be arrested. He says this is self-defense. They say, well, we're going to arrest them, we'll take them to Pikeville and let a judge sort this out. In the meantime, the Hatfields from West Virginia pick up Ellison and take him into West Virginia. Devil Anse is not at this election, but he's summoned. Valentine Hatfield, Devil Anse's brother, is a West Virginia justice of the peace. He's there. So the next morning, they get up and they start towards Pikeville. The reason they didn't that night, it's late. Randolph objects to them being taken at night to Pikeville. It's a long ride by horse. He thinks the odds of them being ambushed is too great to go at night. So next morning they wake up early and they start towards Pikeville. These Hatfield lawmen and their prisoners, the three McCoy brothers, they get short distance away from the election grounds. Valentine shows up with some other Hatfields and says, wait a minute, you don't need to take them to Pikeville. They need to be tried over here. Let's try this here, bring them back. The Hatfield constables argue somewhat. There's no guns pulled, the story goes, most believe, but yet they agree to come back to the precinct where the crime took place. Shortly thereafter, Devil Anse shows up with the rest of his gang. They have dinner. They all do, the McCoys and the Hatfields. After dinner, Devil Anse stands up and he says, anybody that sides with me, fall in. They fall in. He takes the McCoy boys, he ties them up, he puts them on a sled and takes them into West Virginia. Now, there's no legal grounds why you would take them into West Virginia. The crime took place in Kentucky. His brother Ellison's in West Virginia. He wants them over there, so he takes them now by force. The local Hatfield lawmen, the Kentucky lawmen, object. Guns are drawn, and they're saying, we're taking them. The local lawmen are greatly outnumbered, and they let them take them. Now, Randolph rides to Pikeville to try to get help. Big brother Jim is there, and so he's going to keep an eye on things. Not much he can do either because he's greatly outnumbered. They wait until Ellison dies. The reason they wait is because the mother, Aunt Sally, or not Aunt Sally, Sally, goes over and she begs for her son's life. She prays and begs, and they make fun of her. They mock her. They try to get rid of her, but she won't leave. And finally, Devil Anse tells her, I'm going to bring these boys back. Whether my brother lives or dies, I'll bring them back. I promise you that, unharmed to Kentucky. That satisfies her enough to leave. She's also with Tolbert's wife, who's Tolbert's a little older, is now married. The two younger brothers are very young. They're unmarried, the youngest one being 15 years old. Sure enough, Ellison dies. A couple days later, they tie up the McCoy boys again, or they've never been untied. They take them across the river. Good to his word. Devil Anse delivers them back to Kentucky unharmed. They tie them to bushes, pawpaw bushes. They hang a lantern over their head because it's nighttime now, and they shoot them full of holes. Many different variations of that story. I like Big Sam's, and it's very gruesome, so I won't go into details now. But if you want to get the details of that story, I like Big Sam's version. He wrote his own book, by the way. Do we have that here, Everett? No. We don't have Sam's? Okay. We have several books here in our gift shop that you can come and read about the feud. Anyway, the boys are brought back home. They're buried in a single coffin, in a single grave. Both Randolph and Sarah are said not to be there, as Randolph has gone to town to try to get help. He doesn't even know they've been killed yet. They're buried quickly, and people are so afraid of this war now breaking out that not many people show up. There's a state man who wrote another book. It's a very rare book. Only 100 copies were ever made. I'm sure many of those have been destroyed. He says he was there and helped bury the McCoy boys that day. He and his grandfather, but his grandfather tells him as they're digging the grave, if you hear shots hit the ground. That's how worried they were of what was going to happen. There was great excitement in that area. So, that's the election day fight. Now, Randolph gets indictments. So those people who kill the McCoys, the West Virginia gang, are indicted in Pike County courts. We have those indictments. These men are not arrested. None of them are arrested, and that's one of the things we need to learn from this feud, that this delay of justice does not solve things. That hurt does not go away.
I don't know how to respond to that.
I don't know why you tried to respond, Siri. But Randolph continues to try to get these men arrested. The local lawman, the sheriff, remember those Hatfield officials, do not arrest the Hatfield gang as they come into Kentucky. However, the Hatfield gang is coming into Kentucky in numbers. So you got to think, are you tough enough as a lawman to try to bring somebody into Pikeville to jail, knowing what's already happened twice now when a Hatfield gang member was arrested and tried to be brought into Pikeville? It doesn't happen. So they don't arrest anyone. And tensions continue to grow. Imagine the tensions in that little area of the county over there. Still basically between Randolph and the Hatfield gang. But then another event happens. So it's only a few years down the road in 1886. Remember, the election was 1882. In 1886, we have Jeff McCoy. Now, Jeff is a brother to, or he's a son of Asa Harmon. Asa Harmon, by the way, is married to a Cline lady. Her brother is Perry Cline. Perry Cline has now come to Pikeville, has become a prominent member of society here. He's been elected sheriff at only 25 years old, serves his 4 years. He's been a school board, what we call a superintendent today, for 6 years. He becomes an attorney, he becomes state representative. So he's rising quickly at an early age. He is a Democrat, so he shares the politics with the Hatfield gang. But his sister now is Asa Harmon's widow. She has all these children. Jeff is one of these children. Now, Jeff's a troubled young man. Jeff's been indicted in Pike County for murder. He's fled over into West Virginia. Remember, I said that ASA Harmon family were friendly with the Hatfield gang, and he's hanging out with the Hatfield gang, staying away from Kentucky where he's been indicted for murder. Something happens. We're not sure what that is at this point. Different speculation, but he goes mad one day and decides he's going to arrest Tom Wallace for some abuse, some domestic abuse, and he shoots up Cap Hatfield's house. Now, Cap's one of the older sons of Devil Anse and a mean hombre at this point in his life. His wife's laying in bed sick, and he doesn't take highly to his house being shot up. So he's not a lawman, but he arrests Jeff, and Tom Wallace and another guy guard Jeff as they say they're going to take him to Justice of the Peace for shooting up his house. Jeff knows that's probably trouble, and on the way there he escapes, jumps off the horse they have him in. He swims across the river, or runs across the river if it's shallow enough. As he's coming up on the Kentucky side, he's shot in the back and killed by Tom Wallace. Most agree that's true. Some felt like it was Cap, but most agree it's Tom Wallace. Now, you've got this influential, powerful young man, Perry Cline in Pikeville. This is his nephew that's just been killed. He doesn't like that. So for the first time, we've got this strain now between the Devil Anse gang and that ASA Harmon family, including Perry. A few months later, Asa Harmon's daughter, and she's a beautiful woman too, oops. This young lady is married to a Daniels man. She's older at this point and has a daughter that's old enough to be married. And they now have hurt feelings over brother Jeff, this lady's brother Jeff, being killed. So they're supposedly carrying stories now back to the McCoys, telling of the whereabouts and when a Hatfield may be coming into Kentucky. And remember, they need that information so that if they can catch one of them in Kentucky alone, they can arrest them. The Hatfields believe that's true. Whether it is or not, we don't know, but they go over one night to Mr. Daniels' house, who's right on the river, straight across the river from Devil Anse and the rest of the gang. So they go across to the river, and there's an ox on the way there that they see. Cap takes his knife off his belt, slices off the ox tail, takes that tail and wraps it around his fist. Not as a whip, but just as protection for his knuckles. They bust into that house, they hold a gun on Mr. Daniels, they beat this lady and her daughter nearly to death. Severe beating. They take time about beating these women. So Cap first goes after the older lady, hands that cow's tail, that oxen tail, to the other guy who wraps around his fist and goes after the young lady, holding the father of the young lady, the husband of this woman, by gunpoint. He's having to witness this. It's a bad situation. I skipped something. Devil Anse, by the way, knows that he doesn't want to get Perry Cline mad at him. He's a smart man. No one ever said Devil Anse was stupid. So Devil Anse writes Perry. I have that letter here, and I'll pass this around. So in December of '86, after Jeff's been killed, Devil Anse writes Perry in Pikeville and says, there's been trouble. I wished it couldn't happen. I would undo it if I could, but I can't. It wasn't Cap that shot Jeff. It was Tom Wallace. I hope there'll be no further trouble. But there's something interesting that I didn't see when I first read this letter. There's a last page of that letter. After he's already signed it, he says, now in conclusion, so he starts writing again. Now, he probably didn't write. He probably had somebody to write this for him. Most of his deeds he X's, so he's probably illiterate. But anyway, he signs this, or someone signs for him. And at the end of that letter, he says, Perry, the very bottom of this, something, you can't read all these words, I'll pass around and let you see, is nothing more than Mary Daniels and her girls. Bill, her husband, is now gone and says he won't come back. No person's going to harm him. Let him come back. Very respectfully, Anderson Hatfield. So I'll pass this around, but I think it's interesting that he's blaming Jeff and the current trouble, he says, on these girls. So I'll let you see that. Anyway, they're mad at these women. They feel like they're stirring up trouble. And the following year in 1887, they administer this horrible beating. Now at this point, Devil Anse is trying to cause this peace between Perry Cline, knowing that Perry Cline's a state representative. You can't go beating up his family. Cap doesn't listen, apparently. I don't know if Cap does that against Devil Anse's wishes, but Cap and Tom Wallace go across the river and beat these women horribly. And that fires up Perry. Now, how do I know that? There's a lot of this stuff you can't know. All you gotta do is look at the sequence of what happens next. So, we'll skip forward to 1887. These women were beaten in July of 1887. In July 1887. Sometime prior to August 22nd, and we know that because there's a letter to the governor that tells that Perry Cline and Frank Phillips have gone to this governor and talked to him about getting warrants and rewards for the Hatfield Gang. So now you can see Perry's gotten involved. This is only August, only the next month. So probably immediately after this beating and word comes to him, it's time to go after him. So Perry now gets involved. Some people call this the Cline portion of the feud. The Clines being not only Perry, but the rest of ASA Harmon's family is now no longer friends with the Devil Anse gang, and they're coming after him. So Randolph's finally got some more family support coming in to his side. They go to Buckner, and there's a long list of letters going back and forth to Buckner. Buckner is a former Confederate general. He not only is a Confederate general, he's a strong leader, he's just been elected governor. In fact, when he's elected governor, he takes office and 10 days later issues these warrants for the Hatfield Gang and rewards, not only warrants, but rewards, and starts sending correspondence to the West Virginia governor demanding that they be sent. The Hatfield Gang is very powerful. They've got some money. They're very ruthless at this point in their lives, and they control the politics over there. The governor of West Virginia, Wilson is his name. He starts delaying sending these people. He has excuses for why he can't extradite them. The governor of Kentucky continues to send correspondence back and forth. We see this back and forth, back and forth. And finally, the governor, Wilson, says, you know, I've looked into this matter and I don't find these men to be guilty, which infuriates Samuel Buckner. He's a strong man, a strong leader, and he says, look, You're the executive of that state, not the judge. Send them to Kentucky and they'll have a fair trial. They're not sent. There's a Commonwealth's attorney who's not part of the Pikeville group. He actually is from Catlettsburg, and his name is S.G. Kinner, K-I-N-N-E-R. November 28th. Oh, by the way, a funny little story is Devil Anse and Jauncey and a couple other guys write a letter, supposedly in Jauncey's handwriting, to the governor of Kentucky after these rewards have been issued and all this pressure is now coming. They write a letter to him and say they'll agree to cause no more trouble in Kentucky. In fact, not even come to Kentucky and live as peaceful citizens if he'll just take away those rewards and warrants from them. Of course, the governor does respond back and says, yeah, no deal. I don't deal with felons and murderers, so you're going to come stand trial. Now, this Commonwealth's attorney, S.G. Kinner, is really pushing this. I don't know why. I've not figured out his connection now. It's one of the unsolved parts of the feud to me, is why Kinner's so involved. He's not part of the Pikeville group, but he's pushing it now at this point even harder than Perry. He's pushing it even after Perry changes sides. And he tells the governor, he writes the governor in November and says, and this is in 1887, that he's afraid that Frank Phillips has too many close connections to the sheriff of Pike County, Basil Hatfield, and that he's not going to do his job either because Basil's never done his job. And so we need to replace Frank Phillips with another man who will go after these Hatfields. If Frank doesn't do something immediately, this is the end of November '87, the governor receives that letter. Now, shortly thereafter, in December, we know what happens. That's when Frank, who's been made a special agent by the governor to receive these prisoners as they're given over by the West Virginia governor. West Virginia governor won't give them over, by the way. Frank decides to take matters in his own hands. Now, we don't know. There's no proof here. You know, politicians are pretty good at covering up mistakes. We don't know if it's a cover-up. We don't know what happened. There's no proof of this, but we do know that Frank rides into West Virginia in December, shortly after this Commonwealth's attorney pushes, make Frank do something. Well, Frank's not supposed to be doing anything. He's supposed to be receiving prisoners. They've not been brought into Pike County. At this point, Frank forms a posse, and he heads into West Virginia. He says he thinks, this is his excuse anyway, he thinks the governor of West Virginia agrees with the governor of Kentucky, and these men have already been arrested, and he's just going to go to West Virginia and receive them. Whereas
he found out he could cross that river from both sides.
Yeah. So this posse, this Kentucky posse, goes into West Virginia. In their mind, legally speaking, they think, as we go over there, we're not lawmen. There's rewards for these men. We're going over there as private citizens. If we run into one of them, we'll capture them. We'll bring them into Kentucky, and then we'll arrest them as lawmen. That's the way they thought about it. By the way, the Supreme Court ruled that that was not legal. That was an unlawful act. So if you want to be for the Kentuckians, you say, okay, they created an illegal posse here and rode into West Virginia, according to the Supreme Court.
I don't
Now,
agree with you on
I know you won't.
I don't agree with
Well,
you
that's what
on
the
Supreme Court said.
It's just what the Supreme Court said, whether we agree or not. That's what they said.
I don't agree with what you're saying. They said.
We'll look it up afterwards. I've got some of that stuff. I know you've got it too.
Allowed her to read that decision.
Okay.
What they said was, you got it, you keep it.
They did
There's
that.
no law that says you can take them back. You got them, you keep them. That's what the Supreme Court said.
That is true. So, and that's the reason this feud becomes so famous, is that it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Anyway, the posse's riding over there. They're capturing these people, and 9 are brought back into jail. 2 people are killed in December and January of that year. But before we get into January, we've got December here. These people are being arrested. The Hatfields are now on the run. And they come up with this plan to end it. And this makes no sense to me at all. If it doesn't make sense, I wonder why this part of the story happened. But they decide the way to end this is to ride into Kentucky and kill Randolph McCoy and his family by burning their cabin down on New Year's Eve of 1888. I don't know how that makes sense. Obviously, if the governor's involved in giving rewards for your arrest, riding into that governor's state and murdering people is not going to end it, but that's for some reason they say that's what they thought. So they ride into Kentucky that night, in the middle of the night. They catch the cabin on fire. Long story short, because we're not sure of all the details, even though there's a lot of court transcripts on this, they just don't all agree. They kill Randolph's oldest daughter, 31-year-old Alfera, who's said to be sick or crippled. She's unarmed. They shoot and kill her, and that infuriates the entire country, who is now starting to watch this feud take place because of the two governors fighting over this border war. They also kill Calvin McCoy. He's shot in the head, but they don't know they've killed him. He runs as he's shooting. They're shooting at him in the dark. One of the bullets finds his head, and he's killed, but they don't see that. They don't see him fall. They do take Sarah, the mother, as she comes out, and they beat her, and He thinks he kills her. She's not only beaten severely, her ribs are broken near her spine, but he shoots at her in the head. It's dark. All he sees is her hair fluff up. So he goes home and tells Devil Anse that he's killed Sarah. Randolph, however, escapes. He runs. He's got a double-barrel shotgun. Both barrels are discharged as he comes out. He hits two people on his way out of the house, including Chauncey Hatfield, in the shoulder. But he escapes. Even though they're shooting at him in the dark, they don't know that he escaped, but they think he probably did. The cabin's filled with some grandchildren, some other people. They escape. They all live. Sarah's beaten so severely it takes her a week to survive. She's brought immediately to Pikeville for medical attention and for shelter. They have no home now. The home's totally destroyed, everything in it. By the way, we have several artifacts in this second cabinet over here in the museum, including some of those burnt logs from that log cabin. We also have a piece of a bridle, some other things. That site was dug by the Kentucky archaeologist, the official state archaeologist, a few years ago, and that's where these articles were brought into the museum. They're on loan mostly from Bob Scott, who now owns that property. Anyway, so now we have this big event. Anyone that was on the fence until this point now starts siding with the Kentucky side and saying, yeah, these people are crazy. They've got to be brought to justice. The posse comes even more force, even angrier, riding back into West Virginia, and they start taking more captives. They killed Uncle Jim Vance, who's part of that gang that night, raiding the cabin. When they meet up with him and Cap in a big gunfight, Cap escapes, but they kill Jim. They go back over a few days later, and this time West Virginia's formed their own posse, and they meet at the mouth of Grapevine and have a big shootout there. And that shootout, there's a deputy sheriff, Dempsey, that is shot and killed. Now that creates an even stickier issue. Now the Kentucky Posse has killed a West Virginia deputy who's not a Hatfield, and as far as we know wasn't running with that gang. He's there supposedly to try to protect the border and stop these incursions into his state. The two governors are furious. They're riding back and forth. The governor of West Virginia calls up 60 of his militia to send to Logan County, he says, to keep the peace. He urges the Kentucky governor to do the same. The Kentucky governor sends his adjutant general of the whole state up here to find out what's going on in these hills. His name just happens to be Sam Hill. So if you've ever heard the saying, what in the Sam Hill's going on up there? Sam Hill came up here to find out what was going on, and the papers of the country, many of which we have on display over here, from around the country, in fact internationally, papers are now following the story. They're waiting to hear what Sam Hill reports back to the governor. And you think, well, why would this story be so sensational? There's not that many people being killed yet. The reason why is because it's a border war. The governors are involved. Everybody in the country is worrying that a civil war will restart, a war between states. Sounds crazy to us, right? We're living today. We don't think that can happen. This is right after the Civil War. This governor was a Confederate general, captured in the war, the governor of Kentucky. The West Virginia men all have Civil War veterans in their administration. They all believe it could turn bloody. In fact, the state legislature now gets involved. And they send a letter to the governor saying, turn over all of your files, everything you've sent the West Virginia governor, and turn over Sam Hill's report. We want to know what's going on. So the entire state's now afraid that we're getting ready to go to war over this fight in Pike County. The papers are all covering it. The governor of West Virginia is so angry that these men have been killed and that 9 are over here in jail, not far from here, almost on this exact spot, that he appeals their arrest to the federal courts in Louisville. He goes himself and argues that case. That's how angry he is about this. He's a former Attorney General of West Virginia. He's an attorney, and he goes to argue this case. All these prisoners are brought to Louisville. There, the Court of Appeals, on a split decision, agrees that Pike County has the right to try these prisoners. The governor of West Virginia appeals that case to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is all happening very quickly, and not in 1888. And as Betty says earlier, that court also agrees with the Pike County courts that these men can be tried. They do say, however, that the means they were captured by, this posse, that was an illegal and unlawful act. However, now that they're here, there's no provisions in the law that says that they should be sent back. They need to be tried, that they've done some terrible crimes if they're found guilty and need to be punished. So we got the U.S. Supreme Court weighing in quickly. That summer, and late that summer, early fall, the trials take place here in Pikeville. Our courthouse has just been finished. Love this photograph. These are, by the way, while Sam Hill's up here, the Adjutant General of the state of Kentucky, he says, I formed a state guard. There's many men capable of fighting in the state guard. I feel comfortable they'll protect Pikeville and Pike County. This is that guard. We even have the names of every man in that guard. And if you look really closely, in the background you can see our current courthouse, which was just being finished. So I'll pass this if you want to look at this, but this is on display permanently here at the museum.
Reed, was that before or after the trials?
After. That photograph was taken after.
Where were the men tried? This courthouse or another?
This one. The courthouse had just been finished. The first major trial took place in this courthouse. And if you go into the courthouse today and go to the second floor where the county court, fiscal court meets, you can actually see that room where that trial took place. There'll be a play there today, in fact, where you can get to see a reenactment of the
That's what we have been working on with the play. Which courthouse?
It's this one, no doubt. We have proof of the date that the courthouse was finished, and it was just as these trials took place.
I went and looked it all up.
Yeah.
I wish I'd known you knew that. Saved me a lot of time.
So there's a lot of influence pushing these trials. Some people in some recent books have blamed the Pike County politicians for doing this. Actually, there's 3 attorneys here in town who are writing the governor saying, you need to stop this, take away the rewards. It's getting too bloody. There's going to be more bloodshed. We'd rather just this go away. So it's not everybody in Pikeville is trying to make this thing happen. In fact, it's more this judge, Tobias Wagner, and this out-of-town attorney, that's the Commonwealth's attorney, that's really pushing the governor, saying go for it. You not only continue to keep these rewards in place, but we've got more people we think you should put rewards on, and he does. The next year, he adds more rewards and more warrants. So this pressure is not coming from the local Pikeville men. Now we've got several politicians in town and attorneys in town who are now representing these men. At first, Jim York is hired, and his house is on Main Street and exists today and beautifully been restored by the city of Pikeville. So if you want to go see Jim York's house, you can still see his name in the gate. It says York across the top. Jim York's first hired by the Hatfields. Remember, Perry's the one who started pushing all these things. Perry now decides, you know, he's known these Hatfields a long time. They know him. So he writes to them and says, if you want me to represent them, I'll do it for $250. I think I can get the governor to drop these rewards. Devil Anse is a smart man. He knows that Perry's the one that stirred up all this trouble the second time and has pushed the governor, and so he agrees. So now Perry Cline, who first pushed it, he's an attorney. He switches and goes to the Hatfield side and starts fighting for the Hatfields. He's one of the people that tries to get the governor to drop the rewards. The governor won't drop the rewards. There's 2 other men, attorneys here in town, who try to get the governor to drop the rewards. They won't drop the rewards. The McCoys need somebody to represent them, not because they're on trial. They need an attorney to help go through this case, so they hire Jim York. So here you have Jim York, living in his house. Next door to him is Perry Cline. They've both been attorneys for both sides. And the next house over is Randolph McCoy. So Randolph and Sarah and their families living on the corner. Now that house is still there. It's called Cherico's Restaurant, a great Italian restaurant. If you've not been in there, you should go see it. But that's the McCoy house. Unfortunately, Perry Cline's house was torn down. It's no longer there. But it was right next door. These are 30 feet apart from each other. And they're all involved in these feud trials. So, oops. The trials took place. Cotton Top is the first to turn. And he gives a very detailed confession. It's in the state records. It was sent to the governor. He tells not only details of what happened the night that the 3 McCoy boys were killed, but also the night of the firing of the house in great details. Who pulled the triggers, who did whatever. You have that confession here, Everett?
We have a copy of it.
Okay. So that's here at the museum. We also have a photograph of Cotton Top here at the museum somewhere. I remember seeing it. It's up here. Cotton Top is portrayed in the miniseries as a simpleton, a small boy who's really caught up in it and treated badly. That's not true except for the simpleton part. He's the one in the few that probably both sides most agree was not very intelligent. He's intelligent enough to talk and all that, but he's a little slow. Perry Cline didn't want to see him hanged, and he forbid his family to go into that hanging. The reason, after these trials took place and they're all found guilty, the rest of the gangs are given life sentences. The reason Cotton Top, I believe, was sentenced to death was, even though he confessed and turned on the rest of his compadres, he confesses to killing Alfara. She's the only girl killed. She's unarmed. She's a non-combatant, unarmed, and crippled, either through sickness or some kind of birth defect, daughter of Randolph and Sarah. You can see why the jury didn't take highly to that. And so they sentenced him to be hanged. He appeals it after he's sentenced. And that appeal goes also to the Court of Appeals, and they side with the Kentucky judge again saying, yeah, you can't change your plea of guilty. He pled guilty. You can't change your plea after you've been sentenced to death. So the governor issues his death warrant, and in February of the next year, 1890, he is hanged. A little bit of confusion about where that place took place, the hanging. There's a historic marker up by the University of Pikeville, by the Science Building. From looking at that photograph and from something that Big Sam McCoy says, I believe the hanging took place in that drainage, but at the mouth of that drainage. There's some buildings there now that are subsidized housing. They're nice housing though. And the reason I think, I can't prove this, I'm trying to prove it, that the sign got put up at the college was at the time the sign was placed, that was not a desirable place to be in Pikeville. They probably didn't want to put a historic marker in a very undesirable neighborhood. That's since changed, and if I could prove that, I'd try to get that signs moved.
They hung him outside the courthouse, and they took him straight up the hill. I've stood out here outside this old courthouse. I've stood there, and I've looked straight up the hill.
Well, that place isn't nailed down, but we do have photographs that's supposed to be of that hanging. There's some very detailed photographs, and one of the things I like about that photograph, and I believe it to be true, is because you can see the state militia there. Not only are they there, you can see several of those people in the best photograph. I'm not sure which copies we have here. I know we've got several, don't we, Everett? But we have several photographs, but you can see bayonets attached to the rifles, so they're serious. We know at the time this hanging took place that everybody in town was worried about the town being burned down, not only by the Hatfield Gang that hadn't been arrested, but maybe by the West Virginia authorities. They were very worried about this. So the Kentucky militia is in town with bayonets attached to their guns guarding this hanging. Cotton Top unfortunately went to the gallows unrepentant. Many attempts were made for ministers in town to talk to him. In fact, the guy that comes, I love this part of the story, I just found this out. The guy that comes to town, meets with Presbyterians, to become the first president of what's now the University of Pikeville. Back then they called him principal, but we consider it the university to be the first president. His name was David Blythe. He writes back and publishes in a paper his first trip to Pikeville. He gets here in the middle of all this. The Hatfields are all in jail. His first night here, he goes to visit the Hatfields. So I think that's interesting. So many of these ministers, David Blythe. So he's not even from here. He's from northern Kentucky. He'd gone to school, I believe, in Indiana. He's trying to get this job as pastor of this Presbyterian church and as president of the college, which is just being built at this time. In his first night here, he goes to visit the Hatfields. He calls this, when he writes back, he says, he interviews them all, and never more innocent bunch there's ever been. And he puts innocence in like quotations, so they're all claiming to be innocent, I guess. Yes, there were several ministers.
From the Methodist Church.
Many of them try to go talk to, especially Cotton Top, knowing that he will be hanged. He refuses, and he thinks the Hatfields are coming after him. He doesn't think he's going to be hanged. And remember, he's a little bit of a simpleton, but the day they drop him, he's on the gallows, they ask for last words. His last words are, "The Hatfields made me do it." But unfortunately, he went to the gallows unrepentant. He's hanged somewhere here, well, there's disagreements on where the exact spot is. I think I know where it is. Other people disagree. But either way, he's taken straight up the hill from where he's hanged and is buried, we believe, in the Pikeville Cemetery in an unmarked grave. There's no grave up there with his name on it. We believe that's done intentionally so that souvenir hunters or the Hatfields didn't come to town to try to dig him up. So somewhere up on the hill, we do know that he was buried on the hill shortly above where he was hanged. So somewhere up there.
Could you spell the name of that David something?
No, I can't spell any name. I'm really bad at spelling, but I can get it for you. I'm sorry. Part of the fun part of being dyslexic, I've got that kind where you can't spell, so. So I'm almost finished.
You didn't say the one person that tried to stop the hanging.
Well, Frank was there that day, and some stories go that Frank got drunk that day, that he sometimes tended to do, and he tried to stop the hanging and was arrested and put in the Pike County Jail. And there's many other stories about that. I'm not trying to cover all the details today because it would take hours to do that, right, Betty? It'd probably take all day to cover all the details of this. So the bottom line is, the men that were here, most were found guilty. The ones that were found guilty were sentenced to life sentences except for Cotton Top. Shocked some of them, including Valentine. One interesting thing I found this week was when Valentine, who was the Justice of the Peace over in West Virginia, it's Devil Anse's brother, as he's here, he thinks he's going to be released because he says, "I never pulled any triggers." So he thinks he'll be released. He goes to Louisville and is interviewed by the Louisville Courier-Journal reporter. And in that report, I just noticed this for the first time, he says that not only can he come and go out of the jail freely while he's here in Pikeville, that's how confident he is he'll be freed, but he says that John Dills offered to post $50,000 bond for his release, which kind of goes against some of the more recent books that try to say that John Dills was the one pushing all this. So John Dills...
Probably in this museum, isn't it? I have a copy of it. I went to Courier-Journal and got it. In their archives. I'm sure it's here.
Now, was it Colonel John Dills or John A. Dills?
Colonel John Dills. The only one who had $50,000 to post that kind of bond. Now, yeah, that was a lot of money back then. A lot of money. Yeah. Anyway, he dies shortly thereafter. He goes to prison, but he dies in prison pretty quickly. He gets a life sentence because he's only there a few months until he dies. And I don't take that lightly. I know several of his family members live here in town, as I know several of Frank's family that lives here in town. One's with us today. And several of, in fact, Perry Cline's granddaughter still lives here in town, believe it or not. But so when you tell these stories, you have to be careful what you say because these are real people. This isn't fiction.
The woman that got June of the house up on the hill, she was a descendant from the Danielses.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I've got her papers. I'll have to look into that then.
And I think one reason why those women were beaten, not for talking, they were Union.
They were Union too. There is a strong Union Confederate side of this story too, in that Devil Anse and his gang all fought for the South, or their dads did. They have that connection. So then the Pike County side, most of the men on this side were Union people, including these Daniel women's, as Betty brought out. Now, some other things of interest here. Perry Cline, towards the end of this feud, even though he was working for the Hatfields, he's sick. He has tuberculosis and dies shortly thereafter. So even though he had been a very accomplished man, he dies at age 42, 1891, just a year after Cotton Top is hanged. He succumbs to tuberculosis and dies, very, very young. Very accomplished man with the school board, being elected sheriff, being elected state representative. In fact, he passes the law that allows the freed slaves and their descendants to be educated in Kentucky for the first time. That's why to this day we have the Perrier Cline Center, which was a high school, segregated school built in Pikeville for those people to be educated, and they named it after him, even though he had been dead by the time that was built by nearly 40 years. They still thought highly of him. It started out as a wooden school and it was burned down, and then they built it back stone like it is today and named it after Perry.
In 57 or 58 is when we integrated. And I remember they brought the high school over first, the high school kids, and they were kind of slow about getting the elementary students into Pikeville Elementary School. And they even started bringing the teachers over, and they had outstanding teachers at that school.
My wife's grandmother was one of those teachers at the Perrier Cline School. She says she was the first teacher at that school.
Well, the ones they brought over in 57 and 58 were black.
And they had, including Effie Waller-Smith taught for a while, before that school was built. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to wrap up quickly. Not only does Perry Cline die, but Jauncey is finally arrested, but it's all the way up to 1898. The Kentucky governor persists in these rewards and these warrants. He doesn't back down. There's another side of the story in that this Kentucky Posse that rode into West Virginia also has warrants against them for murder because of the two men killed over there. So none of these people can cross state lines or they'll be arrested. Jauncey makes that mistake and is arrested. Some say that the day after he's arrested, the deputy sheriff that arrested him or caused him to be arrested is shot off the back of the train in Matewan and killed by another of Jauncey's brothers. The Hatfield Gang did not continue or did not quit killing just because the feud tensions had ended. They weren't crossing state lines much anymore, but they were still killing people there in West Virginia. That continued way up past the turn of the century. Frank dies of a gunshot soon thereafter, Frank Phillips, in 1898. He's a tough guy. The Hatfields say it was the only man that Devil Anse Hatfield was ever afraid of. He was well spoken, he was highly educated, but he was tough. And unfortunately, he gets in a fight one night, gets shot in the leg by his best friend, and because he's drunk and trying to kill the best friend shoots him in the leg trying to stop him, and it turns into gangrene. They cut off his leg to try to save his life, but he's not saved, and he dies and is buried beside his leg up in the cemetery. You can go see that today. The other big event, I only have a couple minutes left, is, and then we can talk openly as long as you all want to stay, is in 1912. And I don't know if this makes everybody happy, but the facts are the facts. In 1912, Devil Anse, also his real name is William Anderson Hatfield, two of his sons are killed in 1912 in another shootout where they kill another man. Well, that's the first time he's had any of his immediate family, other than his Uncle Jim Vance, but his real close immediate family killed. And it changes him. He's had a cousin that's been after him ever since the Civil War to come to church. He's never gone to church. He doesn't have anything to do with that stuff. He's gone around for decades now calling himself Devil Anse. It's kind of made some fame from that and some money from that, his tough guy image. But in 1912, when these two sons are killed about the same time, he tells Uncle Dyke, the man that's been after him to come to church, that he wants to come to church. He not only comes to church, but he's baptized soon after, and so are his sons. All that year, And I think it truly changes them. So here's a family that has spent decades, ever since the Civil War, taking law into their own hands, administering mountain justice, as they called it, doing what they wanted to do, killing people sometimes in cold blood for no good reason. And now in 1912, that changes. I can't find any photographs of Devil Anse before 1912 that he's not armed and armed to the teeth. From 1912 until he dies, and he dies in 1921, all the photographs he is unarmed, and the rest of his family's unarmed. He looks like anyone else except for the long, distinctive black beard. Other than that, he looks like anybody else's grandfather. He has his grandchildren on his knee. He enjoys his family, and actually spends those last few years of his life living peacefully. His sons, who had been these murderers, had killed a lot of people, and never really served any time except for Johnson's few years. They also are baptized, and they turn around, and they become sheriffs, they become deputy sheriffs, they become attorneys, and he even has a nephew, right, that becomes governor of West Virginia shortly thereafter. From that point forward, that family seems to turn, get on the right side of the law, and are very accomplished people. So it's weird in that when people interview or write books about Devil Anse, they say he was a well-respected member of his community. I believe that to be true after 1912. So the people that knew him in Island Creek, at Sarah Ann, where he lived at the end of his life, felt really good about him. Now, I don't think anybody still would cross him, and they said he continued to sleep the rest of his life with one eye open, with a gun nearby. But I believe it changed his life. I think that was the power of true redemption for him. Randolph, on the other hand, I don't know that story. I do know he died in 1914. He was an old man, 89 years old. He was living with his grandson Melvin, who was there the night of the cabin burning as a little boy. His daughter, Rosanna, had died in the 1890s. We don't know an exact date. There's no death certificate. We know Sarah also died. We've got it narrowed down within about 4 years, but somewhere in the 1890s. He dies in 1914 by falling into a fire. He goes to put a log on the fire. He's almost 90 years old. You can imagine going to put a fire on the fireplace at his grandson's house. He toddles into the fire, catches his shirt on fire, suffers horribly for a few weeks, and dies of pneumonia. A horrible death. So I feel really sorry for him, losing all those children in the feud. Never really feel like he got pure justice, because Devil Anse was never brought to justice. But that's the way he dies, unfortunately.
Lost 6 children.
Yeah, he lost 6 children in the feud. Rosanna, I love the story that's in the Staten book of Rosanna. I hope it's true. I don't know that it is, but on this theme of redemption. She lived in the house where Cherico's is now, and just up Scott Avenue, you'll see a church, a white church with a blue roof. At that time, it was known as a Christian church or a Campbellite church. There was a preacher, a famous evangelist that came to town, and was at that service that night. The house was packed. It's a small church. She was in the audience. He looks out and recognizes her. Everybody knows Rosanna at that point. She's famous. She's been in all the papers. Even though he's from out of town, in the middle of his sermon, he stops and he points out and he says, "Young lady, what's your name? Why do you look so sad?" She says, "I'm Rosanna McCoy," and she had felt the burden of this feud and her siblings getting killed. She felt like that was her fault. I don't believe it was, but she felt like that. And he said, "Why is your head hung?" And she said, "Well, I've done a lot of bad things in my life, and I've caused a lot of people to get hurt." He says, "Do you know the Lord?" And she says, "Well, yes, I do." And she tells him the day that she was saved, which preacher she went to, and where she was baptized. And he says, "Was that after these troubles?" And she said, "Yes, sir, it was." He says, "Well, young lady, you have no reason to hang your head. Hold your head up. You're a daughter of the Most High." He said, "Anybody in this room that has a reason to hang their head is anyone that's looking down at you." And apparently a lot of people in town had. She was seen as this woman who had caused this trouble, and a lot of the people in town looked down upon her. And I love that story that preacher calls out the other people in town and says they need to be hanging their heads. They're the ones that have something that needs to be forgiven. If you've been forgiven, you're a daughter of the Most High. I love that story, and I hope that's the way she died. She died as a young lady in the 30s. In the 1890s, she was in her 30s when she died. She is buried at Dill Cemetery just across the road here. You can see it from this museum, with her mother and father, and also her brother Sam and his wife are all buried in the Dill Cemetery with Colonel Deals and his family. I'm almost finished, and we'll open it up. And we'll talk. Go ahead.
Please.
Go ahead.
And Chauncey is buried with his family. He had all these wives, and he ended up alone. She's buried with her parents. He's buried with his parents.
That's a good point. Never thought of that, Betty. Now, there's some things that come out of this feud that have changed our country, and something that I want to make sure we get today. This whole hillbilly image. The word hillbilly itself doesn't exist until the 1880s. So think of who's the most famous hillbilly. In my mind, it has to be William Anderson Hatfield. William, short for Billy, right? Lives in the hills. That's the term they use. This yellow journalism that invades our town and starts reporting on this feud, they're horrible. Their reporting back to the rest of the world is horrible. They describe us as lazy, as simpletons, all of us. And it has stuck on this community as a curse since that day. And it was wrong, and I can prove it's wrong. And I've spent many years proving it's wrong. And one of the ways I can prove that are the photographs of the people involved in the feud, including Betty's family, the Phillips. If you look at all of these photographs, including the Hatfields, they're all in nice clothes. They're wearing suits. If you look at the pictures of Devil Anse, if you look at the pictures of the McCoys, here's Devil Anse's funeral. You tell me that doesn't look like anybody in any place in this nation, all those people. And of course you can say, well, they're dressed up for a funeral. They were, but you can look at the other photographs. There was a famous photograph for years we thought was Randolph McCoy's family. I think I've been convinced that it's not, but if it's not, it was taken here, and it was taken on that side of the county where Randolph lived. So either way, even if it's not his family, look at the Daniels lady. Does that look like the image you have in your head of the barefoot, ignorant, dirty, simpleton? It's not. None of these are. Devil Anse and his wife. This is later in life. This is one of the kinder Devil Anse photographs after his baptism. Here is his baptism. One funny thing about that, when he gets in the river, he was always witty. He looked up and said, I know you all just showed up today to see if this water would boil when I got in it. Randolph later in life looks sad, looks broken. I don't know how he couldn't be. I would be broken if I'd lost 6 children and the murderer was never brought to justice. Here's the hanging photograph. Look at the people in that photograph. Look how they're dressed. In addition to the guard, everyone there is wearing a suit. Everyone. Cotton Top, the simpleton. This is the simpleton. But look how he's dressed. He's in a suit with a collared shirt on. This is the photograph that for years I believed to be the McCoys. I thought it was Randolph's family. Some people have argued with me, and I think they've convinced me it's not. If it's not, it's still taken in that community. Look how they're dressed. Every single one of them. The men are in suit jackets. They don't all have ties on, but many do. The women are all in really nice dresses. So that yellow journalism that put that curse on us of this hillbilly image that sticks with us to this day was just not true. And to show you how bad it was, Randolph's family, the photograph was taken at the cabin after it was burned. Look how they're dressed. Every photograph's like this. There are none that exist at this time of anybody in this area who is that image of the straw hat, the corncob pipe, and that simpleton. Martha Cline, Perry's wife. Perry's on the wall over here. We got several pictures of all these people. Come to the museum, look at our photographs if you want to dispel that image and that curse that's been put on us. The reporters were so bad, they even started before they got here, before they'd seen anyone. One New York reporter stopped in Catlettsburg, which is the way you got up here. You came to Catlettsburg, then you had to get on a boat and come up here. In Catlettsburg, he reports that the people of Kentucky are so lazy that he has to step over them on the wooden sidewalk to get by the sidewalk. He says they're so lazy that it seems to hurt them to breathe. So that's the kind of reporting that's coming out of here before he ever gets here. That's in Catlettsburg, Kentucky. So that image has stuck with us for all those years and needs to be dispelled. That's one of the things I'm proud that we do in this museum and want to see people come and hear the story that we tell ourselves. That was just wrong. It was not right on anyone, even Devil Anse. And see if I can find my favorite photograph of Devil Anse. By the way, we have Mr. and Mrs. Dills over here. We have Judge York that was the attorney. We have Perry Cline's original photographs or paintings are all here in the museum if you want to come see them. This is my favorite picture of Devil Anse when he was a bad man. And I use that term as the mountaineers use the bad man term. It just means he was a tough guy that enforced the law in his mind is the way he saw it. So this is back in his bad days. But look how he's dressed. He's not a simpleton. He has a suit on. This is not a picture he had made going to church because he didn't go to church at this point in his life. He's got a nice hat on. He's got a suit jacket on. He's got nice boots on. All of these guys dress like that. Even the Hatfields in the midst of their worst part of their life. So anyway, that's what I wanted to wrap up. We've got plenty of time to talk afterwards, although I want to get over to the pig roast they're having at the farmer's market, so we'll get over there eventually. Maybe we can talk some over there too. But Betty has a tremendous collection of books that she's collected over the year and is a treasure to this community. If you have questions about the feud, talk to Betty, who probably knows a lot more about it than I do, or me, either one afterwards, and we'd be happy to answer that. I want to end today by saying we have a donation box here. We certainly appreciate any donations you can give to the museum. We do this as an educational thing for our community. We're glad to have Pike TV here. Wonderful to have Betty here and any of you that attended today. Many events going on today. I hope you enjoy some of the rest of those. Contact me if you have anything else you want to talk about. I'll be here for a few more minutes. Betty will be here, I hope, for a few more minutes so you can ask her additional questions. But that's all I have today. Thank you very much.
Thank
Good day.
you very